This presentation discusses the uses of developmental progressions. A developmental progression is a sequence of levels in increasing competence. So a developmental progression describes what it looks like when you're first beginning to learn about something, then every step in between that you pass through until you're much more competent at doing it. The term levels of increasing competence comes from Glaser. Glaser noticed that skill and knowledge acquisition was a continuum ranging from low proficiency to high proficiency, rather than a state of having knowledge or not having knowledge, having skill or not having skill. While those continuum existed, every point along the continuum could be described or identified by a developmental behavioural criteria. And by noticing those changes of behaviour, you could identify growing skill or increasing competence. However, Glaser acknowledged that you couldn't work practically with an infinite continuum of increasing competence. And for that reason, levels of proficiency or levels of competence are defined that describe skills or behaviours that are in a similar level of difficulty. And by chunking these behaviours into levels, it allows us to think more strategically about the progression of competence, rather than having competence as infinite steps that are all very important, but we're unable to use it in a practical sense. Developmental progressions sit at the core of aligning curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment. Once the progression has described students' typical progression in a particular competence, then that development can be reflected in the curriculum, in the pedagogical strategies that teachers use in the classroom, and in the assessment. Here's an example. This is a progression of numeracy development. This is a very coarse-grained progression. It goes from the very beginning of number and understanding number right through to quite sophisticated conceptions of number. And in doing so, it covers typically 11, 10, 12 years of development. This sort of progression is really good for planning curriculum over year levels, because you know what things typically become before other things. And so you can map a curriculum based on the progression. If the progression is founded empirically, so it's produced from data from real students, that gives a great power to its ability to inform the curriculum. Similarly, when teachers are thinking about informing pedagogy, a course level progression like this can give you insight into how you structure learning experiences over the years. You couldn't use a progression like this you couldn't place students on a progression like this with a single assessment. It wouldn't make sense to ask the same student to count single objects and attach numbers to those, which is at the lowest level, pre-level A. You couldn't expect the same student who you gave that question to also be able to represent fractions on a number line, which is at level F of this progression, or to use linear equations, which is at level J of this progression. To assess this progression, you would choose to assess small slices, either one level or a few adjacent levels to assess. That means you wouldn't try and assess everything, you would assess small slices of one or more levels. Another way that you could assess from this progression is to pick some of the skills within a few different levels and assess those rather than assessing everything. If you were to assess everything in several levels, you would end up with an enormous assessment. So usually when we're working with very coarse-grained assessments, we're looking at assessing part of the progression. It's quite unusual for us to try and assess the whole progression at once. Here is a fine-grained progression of equivalent fractions. This progression would take place just across 2 levels of the previous progression. But if you're trying to figure out how to assess or teach your class in the short term, the big coarse-grained progressions are not terribly useful. You need a finer-grained progression that will allow you to notice small changes that students might do over the span of weeks or months, or even perhaps days. So this progression describes those finer steps that a student might take. A progression like this is very useful for designing a single assessment that you could give to your students. It's also useful for devising teaching interventions or strategies that you could use with your students in a particular lesson or small series of lessons. So a fine-grained progression is useful for assessment and planning in the shorter term. The disadvantage of a fine-grained progression is that the differences between the levels are not so distinct. This means that either it can be difficult to place a student in just one level, or sometimes there's less likelihood that it will describe typical progression, and students might take slightly different paths, and you'll have a greater number of students not fitting this pattern. However, even having said that, it's very useful for planning interventions on a day-to-day basis in a classroom. To summarise that, the grain size of progressions affects their use. Coarse-grained developmental progressions are useful for identifying large changes in competence, and they're useful for tracking changes over years. Fine-grained developmental progressions are useful for identifying the detail of small changes in competence, and they're useful for planning teaching and assessment over days or weeks. It is important to have the right grain size for the intended use. Here's a different example. Instead of being a progression that we would use in a classroom with students, here is a progression of teachers' metacognition about their teaching, and in particular about their differentiated teaching. This progression is coarse-grained in that it would take a long time for teachers to change from one level to the next. Mostly that's because they're quite set, they're adults, they're set in their ways and their patterns of thinking. However, this is still very useful for planning how to change teachers' perspective. It might be that you're a teacher and you would like to build your own capacity to think metacognitively about differentiated teaching. Or it may be that you're a supervisor or a principal or a colleague and you would like to support somebody to change. A progression can be used outside a formal learning situation in exactly the same way. It can be used to track development through informal assessments or perhaps even through formal assessments, and it can be used to design strategies to help somebody change their behaviours. Throughout this presentation, I've been using the term developmental progression, but there are a lot of other words that are used within the literature to mean pretty much the same thing. The word constructs is used in a number of ways, but one meaning of that word, the meaning that's used in your textbook, is equivalent to a developmental progression. Continuum or learning continuum are other expressions that are used to describe progressions. Learning progression is a word that belongs largely with coarse-grained progressions that cover years or substantial periods of learning. Learning trajectory has many meanings within the literature. In some of those meanings, they're equivalent to a developmental progression. But whenever you're listening to words like that, you're thinking about, is it something that describes levels of increasing competence? If it is, then it can be useful for planning, teaching, learning, and aligning it with curriculum. So hopefully you're starting to think by now that developmental progressions are pretty useful and you'd like to get your hands on some. There are some developmental progressions that are published in the research literature. Typically, these are in the areas of science and maths where there's been a great research focus on progression. They're less likely to be found in other subject matter areas. So if you have the need for a developmental progression, but you can't find one from the research literature, how could you make one yourself? Well, here are 6 strategies that you could use. The first 3 strategies are good for developing fine-grained progressions. The second 3, or the last 3 dot points, can be used for either coarse-grained or fine-grained progressions. The first of these dot points suggests that you adapt a developmental taxonomy, something like Bloom's taxonomy or Solow or Dreyfus or Krathwohl. These taxonomies have generic statements that describe increasing competence. And so to use that as a developmental progression, you need to adapt them to the specific context that you are trying to focus on. Another thing that you can use is your experience or the experience of others. This is best when somebody has deep knowledge about how learning typically occurs in the area in question. But if you have that deep content knowledge or deep learning knowledge in a particular area, then using your experience can be a very effective way of describing the stages. If you don't have that deep knowledge yourself, one way that you can do it is to review student work samples. Perhaps we should say review learner work samples to make it count for people who are not in a typical classroom environment. To do this method, you collect work samples from a great range of students with different levels of competence. Then you classify those work samples according to low, medium, high, and outstanding. If you need to have more than 4 groups or fewer than 4 groups, that's fine. Most people are able to identify differences in competence fairly easily from a work sample. Once you've got a collection of work samples at a particular level, let's say we start with the low level, you would then look at those work samples, identify what the students can do, say, make and write at each level, in each one, and look for common themes. You would then synthesize those commonalities into a level statement. Once you had described one level, you would then put those work samples aside, collect the work samples from the next level, and do the same process. Look for the similarities or the commonalities across those work samples, particularly noting the things that you didn't note in the previous level that those students couldn't do, but now at a more sophisticated level of competence they can. And you would write a description of that, synthesizing all the different ideas, and continue until you had finished describing your levels of competence. Another strategy that you can use is to adapt general stages of development within various learning theories, for example, Piaget. Another way is that you can use a process of pairwise comparison. In a process of pairwise comparison, people make a series of judgments about which of a pair of skills or a pair of behaviours is more difficult. Once you've compared every possible pair, you then have a ranking of all of these behaviours from the easiest right through to the more difficult. You then collect behaviours that are in the same area, the same location, and you identify commonalities, synthesize them, and write a level description in exactly the same way that you would do for reviewing student work samples. The final way that we're going to talk about that you can describe a developmental progression is to use what's known as a Gutmann analysis. Part of a Gutmann analysis leads to the ordering of skills. These ones are not ordered based on people's opinions, but rather based on student data. It might be that you've conducted an assessment, collected a whole lot of different data about what students got right and didn't get right, what they can do and they can't do. And then the Gutmann analysis takes that data and produces the order for you in the same way as the pairwise comparison produced an order through judgment, and the review of student work samples produced an order by judgment at a very broad level. From that, once you've got the order, the process is exactly the same. You identify clusters of similar behaviours at similar levels of difficulty, and you write a level description from those by synthesising the different things together until you've got a generic statement. From there, you can move to the next cluster, and that would be the next most difficult, and so on and so on. Any of these strategies will allow you to describe a developmental progression of the grain size that you need for the purpose that you want to use it for. Knowing which strategy to use when is important, and also knowing that there are different degrees of accuracy in what you do. With something that's based on data, like a Gutmann analysis, being more accurate than something based, for example, on student work samples. Whichever method you do, it will provide you with a developmental progression describing increasing levels of competence that you can use to align curriculum, teaching, pedagogy, and assessment. It'll allow you to plan assessment and interpret assessment information, and it will allow you to devise teaching strategies in your classroom. It also can be used to give some thoughts about whether the curriculum is appropriate, if it's effective, and if it needs to devise a new curriculum to help you think about the structure of that curriculum. I hope this presentation has helped you think about the uses of developmental progressions. Thank you.